I want to thank you for being here. I'm so glad you're here as we are in the fourth and final week of this series on relationships. And by now you've got it all buttoned up, right? All those relationships are just piece of cake, figured out, you're good to go. This will be quick. The thing that I was thinking about this week is relationships in life are a source of some of our greatest joys. And relationships in life are the source of some of our greatest pain and heartache as well. We started week one talking from Genesis 1 and 2 that we have been created for relationship. Like if you want to know part of the purpose that you've been created, why are you here? You and I, we've been created to relate to other people. Not created to be like independent, but interdependent. Not created to be disconnected, figure it out for yourself, but to be interconnected with other people. And that's a part of how God made us. In Genesis chapter 1 and 2, it tells that story. But in Genesis 3, there's this division, there's this rebellion, there's this breaking apart, both of our relationship with God and with each other. And that's been a part of our story ever since then. How do we get along with people who aren't always easy to get along with? And Jesus invited us into this pattern of life to love the Lord your God with everything in you first, and secondly, to then love others as yourself. Well, how do you do that? You've got to be receiving God's love, walking in God's love to even be able to get close to that. The second week, we talked about this idea of conflict, that we will, in our relationships, have conflict, that we are people, all of us, who have conflict to whatever degree with other people right now in our lives. Maybe this morning on your way to church, you had conflict with someone. And life is not about getting rid of all conflict, it's navigating the conflict well. And then last week, we talked about communication, and a secret to communication is not just what you say, but it's how you listen. And you listen to understand, because we all want to be heard. We all want to be known. We all desire to be understood. And the greatest gift you can give someone potentially this week could be a listening ear, that you're heard, you're known, you're cared for. And so today we're going to talk about expectations. As we land at this series, we're going to talk about expectations. And expectations are a weird thing, a strange thing. You and I, we may or may not be aware of the expectations by which we live life. So I don't think of myself in general as a naive person, but evidently when it comes to relationships, I have a little element in me that can be naive. When my wife and I were engaged to be married, there was a season of life that I'm 100% truthful. I thought, we're going to get married and life is going to get easier. I don't know where that came from. I don't know where I thought that would somehow magically just boof and everything would start to make sense. But I realized that on one hand, it's better than ever. And on the other hand, it got harder than ever. And navigating that up and down is part of what marriage is all about. 6 years ago or so, we moved here, and all of our kids were elementary. Now they're all almost teenagers. And I remember thinking, I can't wait till we love our kids, raise our kids, send them off to college or whatever, get out of the house, and parenting is done. And some of you are like, oh, it's only just begun when they're out of the house. I became a lead pastor, and I don't know why, I don't know for what reason, but I sort of thought, everybody's just going to get along. And it's going to be amazing. We're Christians after all. Like, oh, wait, there's a lot of you who potentially have a lot of expectations. And how do I live through that, and how do we navigate through that? When my wife and I were engaged, I remember one night we were sitting in my parents' house, and it got to be about 8:15 at night, and in the middle of watching a TV show, my dad spoke up and just said, well, it's about that time. And my fiance, now wife, looks at me and she's like, it's about time for what? Well, my mom jumped up when he said this, and 5 minutes later, voila, we all had a beautiful bowl of ice cream in our hands. And she's like, what just happened here? I was like, I don't know. It's just always been that way, that about 8:15 at night, my dad always would say, well, it's about that time. And every single night, 5 minutes later, ice cream appeared in our laps, and it was amazing. And I was like, why are you questioning this? It's a beautiful thing. And then we got married, and one night I tried it. Well, it's about that time. And she threw the couch at my face. It didn't work that way. And we were talking like, I wonder if my parents ever sat down in the courtship process and said, well, here's an expectation. My expectation is at 8:15 at night, I'll just make a statement. Well, it's about that time. And the expectation is ice cream will appear. I don't know if they ever had that conversation. It feels weird to me, but some of you are judging them right now. And if I told some of your stories, everybody would be like, you do what? Because we just have expectations. We live with expectations. And I don't think the goal is to get rid of them. I think the goal is to figure out how to navigate them. Because there's some things that I do believe we have the right to expect. We have the right to expect respect from one another. We have the right to expect compassion and kindness. But there are a host of things we have no reason to expect them. Have you ever said or heard someone say, well, if they really loved me, they would just know that this is important to me? I mean, especially if you're dealing with the male of our species, you're in a lot of trouble if you think we're mind readers. Have you ever thought, well, in this relationship, I just don't want to get hurt. I don't want anyone to ever let me down. Then you don't really want a relationship. You want a robot to interact with. Or I hope these feelings never change. And then you come back from the honeymoon and you're back to reality. I hope they never need anyone else. I want to be their only BFF forever. Or I hope I'll always be their top priority. Well, you won't. I just hope this relationship, or I would expect if we really loved each other, this relationship wouldn't take any work. Every relationship takes work. The expectation has to be, will you do your part? And will I do my part? And then appropriate expectations for the appropriate people will help us not be frustrated and disappointed. See, an expectation is something that two people agree to their ends of responsibility. You can't be disappointed that someone didn't fulfill their expectations that they never agreed to, right? That doesn't make any sense. But so often as we navigate expectations, we step on each other's toes. We disappoint without ever knowing it. The philosopher/actor Ryan Reynolds said, when you have expectations, you are setting yourself up for disappointment. William Shakespeare said, expectation is the root of all heartache. So then here's my question. Then what do we do about it if that's true? Give up? I'm just not going to expect anything from anybody because people just disappoint us. Or lower our expectations so low that anybody will do. Or do we figure out a process in life of adjust, appropriate expectations, adjust, and then renew, adjust, and then renew. I'm going to invite us to this approach to life that says we've got to be the kind of people, if we're going to endure life and the seasons and the ups and the downs of life, that when it comes to expectations, we're looking at the right people with the right expectations, and then we're adjusting when necessary and renewing where necessary. If you have your Bibles, grab them, turn to John chapter 2. And then in a few minutes, we'll get to Galatians chapter 6 as well. But starting in John chapter 2, I love that this example happens so early in the Gospel of John. In John chapter 1, you see that John is writing a gospel in some ways very similar to Genesis chapter 1. John chapter 1 verse 1 starts off, in the beginning. So John, the apostle, is giving us this idea and understanding of who Jesus is. And the beginning of Jesus doesn't just start with his birth at Christmas time in our stories. It goes back to the very beginning. And John explains who Jesus is. And he explains that Jesus has come in flesh, in physical form. He's come to be truth and grace for us. And Chapter 1 talks about the interaction with John the Baptist, as John the Baptist says that there's one coming and he's now here who's greater than I am. You get to the end of chapter 1 and Jesus is calling his disciples to come follow him. You get to John chapter 2 and Jesus is at a wedding and his disciples are at a wedding and they run out of the wine that they're serving for the wedding. And Jesus' mother comes to him and says, Jesus, you got to do something about this. And he says, well, it's not my time yet, but because it's his mother and he doesn't want to disappoint her or say no to her, he does a miracle of turning water into wine. And then you get to verse 13 of chapter 2, and Jesus goes to the temple to worship. But in the temple, he sees that all they're doing is making it a marketplace, and they're selling all these things, and they're missing the point, distracted from worship. And Jesus flips over the tables. It's like he gets angry, and he turns over the tables, and in turning over the tables, he's turning over expectations of who people think he's supposed to be. And he's trying to give a proper understanding of who he really is. And then you get to chapter 2, verse 23. Now, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs he was performing and, say this word with me, believed. Believed in his name. So many people, many in the crowd, they see the miracles that he performs. They hear the amazing teaching. And again through the gospel accounts, when people hear Jesus teach, they're like, who is this that teaches with such authority? They're amazed at both his miracles and at his message. And they, quote unquote, believe. Look at verse 24. But Jesus would not, say this word with me, entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. He did not need any testimony about mankind, for he knew what was in each person. The word that you said out loud in verse 23, believed, and the word that we said out loud in verse 24, entrust, they're the exact same Greek word. It's interesting. It's this idea that among the crowd, the people who were enamored with Jesus, the people who were impressed by his miracles, and even the people who were like, wow, he's such a great teacher, they believed, but they didn't really believe, if you know what I mean. They believed, they were impressed, they wanted to see more, they were impressed, they wanted to hear more, but they didn't believe in a sense of any kind of repentance or sorrow or turning to God. They believed in the sense that James says, even the demons believe in God and they tremble, but they don't obey, they don't surrender. They don't seek to be changed by God. They know in their minds, they believe in their minds that God is powerful, that Jesus has died and been victorious. They just don't believe it applies to them. They've made no change. There's a kind of believing that's not a saving kind of believing. It's just oh yeah, that's what he did. But not seeing the application for our lives. And so those people who believed that way, Jesus did not entrust himself, or he did not enter into a relationship with them like he did other people. So, see, the way that we look at the life of Jesus, the way that not just the miracles, not just the teaching, but the way he did life is even instructive to us. That there's these people in a crowd, so like there's levels of relationships, or I call them concentric circles of relationship, that those in the crowd who they didn't really believe, they were infatuated or impressed with Jesus, but they didn't trust him. He didn't entrust himself to them. There's crowds all around him everywhere he goes. But then there's people who are closer to him. There are contacts. Maybe they had dinner with Jesus. Maybe they spent a little bit of time a little bit closer, but they still weren't like those that are close friends. Close friends, Jesus had 12 disciples and a few other people who were a part of his close friends, but there weren't many. The truth is, you can't have 100 close friends. You got to have people who are a little bit closer to you. But then even Jesus himself had an inner circle: Peter, James, and John. And the way that Jesus interacted with those in his inner circle was way different than the way Jesus interacted with those who were in the crowd. In a moment of great celebration and sort of a high moment of Jesus' life on this earth was his transfiguration. For just a moment, he revealed himself in all of his glory, and there were only 3, Peter, James, and John, who were there. In a moment of greatest sorrow and agony, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane before he heads to the cross. And Jesus invites some of his disciples to come with him and pray. And he says, my soul is in agony. We're told he's like sweating drops of blood. He's so in anguish. And he asks three, Peter, James, and John, will you come to the garden with me and pray? He comes to them after praying for a while, and they're asleep because it's been exhausting. It's been a hard road. And he's like, can't you even watch and pray with me? Come on, guys. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Jesus never said to the crowds, can't you be with me in this? He didn't entrust himself to the crowds like he did to his inner circle. And Jesus had certain expectations, but what's interesting is part of the way he related to them was constantly to his disciples, taking their expectations of who they thought he would be and adjusting their expectations, renewing them. Like, no, you're not thinking correctly. Adjusting the expectations and renewing them and giving them purpose. The disciples thought Jesus is the Messiah. He's going to come and be like the champion for the Jews, be like, give me a J, like cheer the Jews, like lead the Jewish people out of the Roman Empire, militarily defeat the enemy and set them free. And Jesus is like, my kingdom, it's not by force. It's not with a sword. My kingdom, it's with love and service to others. Takes his disciples, turns their expectations. Even James and John, two in the inner circle, they're brothers. They come to Jesus with their mother one day. Hey, teacher, please, when you come to your kingdom, will you let these two, James and John, sit at your right and your left and rule and reign over you? And Jesus says, do you know what you're asking? And they're like, yeah. He's like, no. You don't even know what you're asking. And he says, but whoever wants to be great in my kingdom, learn to be a servant of all. And he adjusts and renews the expectations. You're not looking at me correctly. So you're going to be frustrated or disappointed if you don't have the right expectations. Have you ever just evaluated your expectations before God? Like, what are you hoping that God would do for you? A couple of weeks ago, here's what we talked about, that in the core of relationship that we have, it's this relationship with God, the core relationship of our lives. We're invited to love God with all of that is in us. But we said we can't just do that on our own. We can't just muster up feelings of loving God. We have to experience the overwhelming love of God. We have to stay centered and grounded and rooted in God's love, a new identity, being filled with God's love so that we can then love other people. Meaning this, our expectations of God have to be in the right place before our expectations of others. Because if we don't have God in his right place, we're going to be looking to other people to do what only God can do. We're going to be looking for a spouse to complete us when God says, only I can do that kind of work. We're going to be looking for a friend to never disappoint us when God says, only I can do that. We're going to be looking for other people to do what only God can do until we're secure here. And we got to adjust those expectations. And so Jesus is constantly adjusting and renewing his followers' expectations. So what about you? What kind of relationships do you have? And do I have appropriate expectations for appropriate people? We're all a part of a crowd. You're in a crowd right now. There's people who you don't even know their name. You don't recognize them, but you're in a crowd. You're together, but you're not really together. You know what I mean? And you wouldn't expect someone to know your name if you've never met them, so there's different expectations. But then you have contacts that are closer to you do life with, maybe you work with, you go to school with, they're neighbors, but you have different expectations for them, but then you have close friends. Well, how do you relate to them? Like I said, you can't have 100 close friends, so there have to be a different set of expectations for them, but then you have an inner circle. And who's in your inner circle? And this whole conversation for me it raises more questions than we have to give answers in the next 15 minutes and 35 seconds. But it's also a set of questions. Do I have the right people in my life close to me and in my inner circle? There's an old Japanese proverb that says, when the character of a person is not clear to you, look at their friends. There's another proverb that says, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. We are being influenced. We are being impacted by those who are closest to us. So there's an evaluation, like, are they the right people close to us? But here's the idea, that when God is in his rightful place and we're following him and we're living for him, at the core of who we are, every other relationship is impacted by our relationship. It's influenced by our relationship with God. And when we're filled and when we're full and our expectations of God are in the right place, we're enabled to then step out in that inner circle and be who God called us to be, and step out into those close friends and into the contacts and into the crowd and live in the right perspective, with the right kind of wisdom. But if we're not secure in the core of who we are, we will be looking for others to do for us what only God can do for us. And we will be disappointed continually. And we will be frustrated over and over again until God meets these desires and enables us to then go out and live accordingly. Because when it comes to expectations are often unconscious, like we're not even always aware of them. They're often unrealistic. Until we speak and think through them, we're like, yeah, that doesn't really make any sense. That nobody will ever disappoint me for the rest of my life, does it? Like, yeah, it doesn't really make any sense. They're often unspoken. Well, I just thought you would do this. Well, why did you think that? They're often unagreed upon. Nobody said, yeah, I'll get your ice cream every night at 8:15 when you say, it's about time. Or for those of you who are married, when you say, it's about time about other things that you don't agree with. It doesn't always go well. So how do we work through this to have the kind of expectations for the right kind of people? I was reminded this week about a theologian, Walter Brueggemann, writes specifically about the Psalms, but he says he thinks it applies to all of our life and all of our relationships. There's this process that the Psalms take us through that all of life does. A first, orientation. Orientation is like the beginning. It's like the foundation. It's like when we get started. And then there's disorientation. It's when a season of difficulty comes. Trials come. A hard time comes. And then there's reorientation, where hopefully we can adjust and renew and find a new path. And orientation is when we're in a season of life that everything is going well. Everything's making sense. There's building a foundation. We as a family, we're figuring out how to do family life and focus on raising kids and doing life and all of that. And then there was disorientation when our daughter was diagnosed with terribly aggressive brain cancer and immediately went into surgery. And 5 weeks later, we were still in the hospital, still in recovery, and we made the greatest mistake of our lives at that moment. We went on social media. Don't ever go on social media in times of trials. And on social media, we saw people posting, our friends posting like, I'm so nervous. Oh, I'm so sad. My baby starts kindergarten next week. And we're like, we wish our baby was starting kindergarten next week. There's a disorientation to say, this isn't going like we planned. This isn't how things were supposed to be. So we had a choice. There's a path of bitterness and anger, or there's a path of quiet trust. The reorientation is, will we adjust and renew, or allow God to adjust and renew, or we'll say, this isn't my plan. You didn't do what you said you would do. Well, FYI, God never promised every child kindergarten. So adjust and renew and say, okay, God, you got to help me with this. It may be for you that marriage was so good. It felt like it was so strong. And then adultery, disorientation. What do we do? Where do we go? And the question is, will you allow God to adjust and renew your heart, or will you take the path of anger and bitterness? It may be that your family felt like everything was going well, felt like it was solid, and then boom, divorce, disorientation. What's going on here? If there's a question of will you trust, will you allow God to do this work of reorientation, adjust and renew, or will you say, no, I can't take this pain anymore? In Great Expectations, Charles Dickens writes about Mrs. Haversham, this lady who was the daughter of a very, very wealthy man, engaged to be married. On the morning of her engagement, she receives a note from her soon-to-be husband that he will not show up at the wedding and he does not want to marry her. At 8:40, she receives this letter and literally her world stops. She takes every clock in the house and she moves it to 8:40, and it's forever stuck in a moment of disorientation. She refuses to take off the wedding dress, and over time it dulls and it gets yellowed, and she's stuck in a moment of disorientation. And that's possible for all of us when life disappoints, when we're hurt, when we're disappointed, to get stuck. Or we can follow God in the process of reorientation, adjust and renew. Our expectations can be changed to be more appropriate to what God has for us. Would you turn to Galatians chapter 6? I feel like I just gave you the hard and the negative examples, but adjusting and renewing expectation applies to all seasons of life. Your kids graduate. They're no longer babies. As a parent, you must adjust and renew. You can't call them every day and say, "Did you eat breakfast?" At some point, they've got to figure out to feed themselves, right? Your children get married, they start a new family, and you can't call them and say, "Did you change the kids' diapers?" At some point, you have to adjust and renew. This is the highs and the lows of life of figuring this out. In Galatians chapter 6, the Apostle Paul is writing to help us understand the ramifications and the application of how do we relate to people in life. In chapter 2, he writes something that's fairly common in his writings. Verse 2, Paul writes, "Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ." Just stop for a second there. Carry each other's burdens is this idea that we're in life together. We're not trying to figure it out all by ourselves. We've got others with us. But he says specifically carry each other's burdens. What do you think that means? A burden can be a diagnosis. A burden can be an economic hardship in our lives. A burden can be just a relationship that's not going well. Specifically for this context, go back to verse 1 and you'll see a burden is that a brother or a sister, somebody in God's family, is in sin. And the question is, do we just give up on them? Do we just say avoid, let them figure it out? Paul says, no, actually carry each other's burdens. Enter into that situation. And I love this. And you will fulfill the law of Christ. What's the law of Christ again? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and strength. And the second one is just like it, love your neighbor as yourself. See, Paul says that's the center of it all. That's the core of it all. That's what you've been created for. That's how you find purpose. You and I can fulfill the law of Christ in our lives, in our relationships. We can be in the center of God's will as we love God with everything in us and our neighbor as ourselves. And as we love them, it's expressed by carrying each other's burdens. Now, here's the deal. You can't carry the burdens of 100 people all by yourself, right? There's a specific application to your inner circle, to those who are close to you. But there's also a specific application just for the church in general. We need each other. Can you imagine if this was Paul saying, "I'm the apostle, I will carry your burdens"? And the church could be it could grow radically to 8 people, and then Paul's tapped out. It's like we each need to do our part. We each have a role to play. We each have a responsibility to carry each other's burdens, to figure out how to do this. And when we're disappointed and when we're frustrated, because we will be when we carry each other's burdens, we adjust and renew. we adjust our expectations and we renew our hope, peace, joy as we stay centered in who God is and filled in what He has called us to do. Then we can go and be who He's called us to be. Where did I stop? Verse 3. If anyone thinks that they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. That's like patting yourself on the back and giving yourself too much credit. Each one should test their own actions, then they can take pride in themselves alone without comparing themselves to someone else. For each one should carry their own load, which I think is so fascinating. Paul starts by saying, carry each other's burdens, and then you fulfill the law of Christ. But before you do that, remember this, carry your own stuff. Like, take responsibility for you. Get your heart in the right place. Have your expectations of who God is and what He's going to do for you and of others in proper alignment be adjusted and renewed again and again and again, day by day, so that you can then help others. At this stage of life, we're 5 or 6 weeks away from 3 teenagers. And we find ourselves having these conversations like, what are appropriate expectations of your friends? What are appropriate expectations, kids, towards a teacher? What are appropriate expectations in life of people? And FYI, you will be disappointed. But adjust and renew. And we're trying to help our kids understand that. And what we learn as we try to help our kids understand this, we have some work to do in this also. We've not arrived. We need to keep figuring out how do you do this better. We've got to grow because sometimes we stay frustrated or disappointed because we don't have appropriate expectations either. Because when expectations are just unconscious, they may be unrealistic, and we've got to become aware of them to deal with them. We've got to make them realistic and say, let's deal with this. When expectations are unspoken, it actually helps to just speak them out. And maybe you'll speak them out and be like, that's silly. Or maybe you'll speak them out and another person says, I don't want to do that. Well, guess what? If they say that, they're not in your inner circle. Kick them out. But if you didn't ever invite them in the first place, then they shouldn't be there, period. I can't choose to be your BFF. You know what? Today, I like you. You're a really nice person. I want to be your BFF. It doesn't work that way, does it? You're invited because you've been trustworthy. You're invited because there's a connection. And it's just silly for us to live our lives, although we do it, as if everybody's going to be our close friend. And then everybody is constantly disappointing us. We're the ones who have to be adjusted in that moment. We're the ones who need to see in a new way. We're the ones who need to see, actually, when we are being filled, that's what I love about that phrase, carry each other's burdens so you will fulfill the law of Christ. Fulfill is this idea of completion. It's this idea of a perfecting work. It's this idea that in our relationships and in our life, God wants what's best for us. He wants our relationships to thrive and to flourish and to be full. And it doesn't mean they'll always be easy, but it means through the ups and the downs, God's desire is that they're flourishing aspects of every relationship that we can be a part of. But we've got to do it His way. And as we allow Him to fill us, you know what I'm reminded about? You've got expectations for your life. You've got expectations of God. But God's got expectations of you and what your life is to be. And when you're thinking about what you're dreaming of for your life, and when God's thinking about what He's dreaming of for your life, whose dreams are better? The prophet Isaiah says, God's ways are not your ways, and God's thoughts are not your thoughts. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so are God's ways above your ways and God's thoughts above your thoughts. Paul says in Ephesians chapter 3 that our God is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or imagine according to His power. So whose thoughts and whose expectations are better? God's are. So why would we not be the kind of people who adjust and allow Him to renew? Him to adjust and Him to renew. Him to take the Word and His Spirit and his church, meaning people, and shape us and adjust us so that we think right. So we're shaped right. All of us have some kind of origin of relationships, some kind of family of origin. But then the moment we become a Christian, that's why Paul says, brothers and sisters, we're in a new family. And no matter what kind of family you came from, I just want to tell you this, you came from some kind of dysfunctional family. It may be a little bit of dysfunction or it may be a lot bit of dysfunction. But every family of origin that you came from and I came from has dysfunction. And God is saying, I want you to be a part of a new family with new brothers and new sisters. And guess what? We're still dysfunctional too. But we, unlike every other family, have a perfect Father who's watching over us and wanting to reparent us by his church, his word, and his Spirit if we let him adjust and renew, transform, and work in our hearts. And if we stay centered in saying, God, you are the one who fulfills the hopes and the dreams, and then enables us to be the kind of people who step out into those closest inner circle relationships, and we're the spouses, the parents, the best friends that our spouses, children, best friends need. Step out into the closest relationships with proper expectations and proper responses and be who God wants us to be, but not be God for anybody. And point others to say, he will not disappoint you. He will not let you down, but you got to look to him and not to me. Will you pray with me? God, help us, please, to never settle for less than what you desire. God, help us to be the kind of people who for all of our lives, we're moldable, we're open for you to adjust and renew, for you to take our expectations in the moments of disappointment and frustration and not let us become hard, but let us become more open to grace and hope and peace and joy, even in the hard days and the pain. God, we want to thank you that you are faithful, that you are good, that you are trustworthy, and that you have an unlimited supply of love to pour into us. And so we beg you, God, to work in our lives as only you can, to work in our relationships as only you can. Because I know there's people in this room today who they're struggling deeply with wounds, with a conflict that is so raw and it's so real right now that it's almost hard to see you because of the pain in front of us. But I pray that you would give a perspective to be able to see you and sense that you're near, and that you would bring the healing that the hearts in this place so desperately need. The hope that restoration, reconciliation is possible that we need to hear. And then the clarity, what do we do? What is our response? We're not responsible for somebody else. We're responsible for ourselves before you. What do we do now? So remind us of your power, remind us of your grace, remind us of a cross where you carried all of our burdens to the cross so that we can carry each other's burdens. You victoriously rose from the grave, defeating sin and shame and death and hell so that we can be free to live a new life and even fulfill your law of loving you and loving others. So set us free by your power, by your grace, and then bring to our relationships that love that we so desperately need. It comes from you. It's empowered by you. We can't do any of this apart from you, but with you, Christ, we can do all things. It's in your name we pray. Amen.